Minutes. I know I have not reviewed those minutes. Can you pull those up for us, Kathleen? And I'll just try to.
Andrea, do you have them handy?
I can get them.
We can move to a motion.
Move to approve. Second.
Any opposed? All right, very good.
Was that Robert that seconded?
I think I was one of them.
Okay.
I think, Jim, you should say, seeing that we have a quorum, we can approve.
Man, you're funny, dude.
But it sounds like as long as Kathleen and Andrea show up, the minutes are approved, right?
No,
We're not voting members.
Okay.
At least one voting member.
We just need one of the voting members to show up and we're good.
Now, hold on, everybody. Having said that,
we might need to revisit that.
yeah, no, having said that, I can speak as the chair of the rest of the group. We tend to frown on small numbers when it comes to voting actions, only because you're right, we don't record it in the minutes. However, from a ethically government type standpoint, we like to have a few folks, you know.
Yes.
So at least we can say we had a discussion regarding the action.
Yes, and that's typically what happens. Not just one person shows up.
Yeah.
So
Even with email
I think if
voting,
just
we
one
did very
person
well.
showed up, we wouldn't actually have a meeting. So.
Yeah, we probably do need to look at how it's written, Andrea, just to, from a governance point of view.
Is an excellent segue.
Uh-oh,
to
here we
the
go.
item we need to slip into the agenda. So okay, there's two things that we need to slip into the agenda, and they're just information. One is on your agenda, which has the new meeting dates for January. We have a meeting date for January 5th. We are going to cancel that January 5th meeting and move it to the 7th. And that we anticipate that will be a fairly short agenda. The state has issued an RFP for more CARES Act funding, and it is due January 22nd. And so in order for us to run the local process, Sharika is having trial by fire and running, right? They are putting out the local request for proposals on Monday, the 21st of December. It is due the 31st of December. The ratings panel is going to look at it on the 5th. The operating cabinet is going to review it on the 6th, and we need to approve it on the 7th. In order to get to city council before the 22nd. Yeah, go ahead.
Breaking up.
I'm breaking up.
I think it might be on your end, Susan. I can hear her okay.
Okay.
Is anybody else having trouble with Andrea?
Well, I got trouble with her, hearing her fine, but it's.
Yes. We won't
Yeah,
go there.
okay.
I would like to keep people on their toes.
So Andrea, on that timeline, it's the 7th, the last, you said that these are due back on the 20th or early?
They are due to the state on the 22nd.
Yes.
Okay.
But Sharika can tell you more specifics about the timeline. The other timeline we're working up against is getting it on the city council agenda.
Yes. So they were released December 4th. The RFP was released December 4th. So we were able to do a CARF last week and get a request for proposals out to all the agencies, which will open on December 21st. We gave them 10 working days, 10 days to complete the applications, which gave a due date of December 31st. In order for us to get it to the city council by the 19th, we have it going to the COC rating panel, the January 5th, the COC operating cabinet, January 6th, the Commission on Ending Homelessness, of course, January 7th, and then we have the City Finance Committee and the City Community Development Committee, January 11th and January 12th. So it was a really tight 30-day deadline. So it's trying to fit everyone into those 30 days, caused us to have to rearrange some meetings.
Welcome to the party, Sharika.
Yeah, I will send out a new updated calendar invite, moving the 5th to the 7th. And I believe
Can you
it's
still, Jim, can you
8:30
still do that time we talked about, 8:30 on the 7th? Okay,
Yep.
awesome. So it'll be 8:30 on the 7th.
Thank you.
And then those of you who are not morning people will be happy to know that the rest of our meetings in 2021 will be at 2:30 in the afternoon.
Awesome.
So you consider 8:30 morning? That's kind of late.
At the banker.
Jim, I operate on your timetable, so I'm with you. I'm good for 8:30.
Right.
Yeah, no, this is
Right.
good.
I think like 8 or 9 at night is a good end to the working day, because I've got all these other hours once I get home until, midnight or 1 before the day actually ends.
I understand. All right, well, so you wanted to add, was there more you wanted to share on that topic? Okay, I
No,
thought so.
not on that topic, but one other thing, which was really the segue. The governance charter tasks the operating cabinet to review the charter every year. So this year, the operating cabinet has been doing a very thorough review of the charter, has a number of recommended changes to it. They reviewed it at their meeting on they have reviewed the recommended changes at their meeting on this Tuesday. We're soliciting more feedback from written feedback from folks. Once that comes out, we will send that charter with the suggested changes to the commission for your review and comment. So if we do want to look at, I don't think they made any comments around the quorum voting for the commission. So.
And I think I sent it out to you guys Wednesday or Tuesday. Can't remember, but
Okay.
I believe I sent it out.
Mhm.
And I echo Max's
Yeah.
comments from earlier. I think, I'm a pretty big proponent for governance, and I think this is an area where we want to make sure we've got the charter laid out appropriately for governance. I'm not saying we don't, but I think we need to just look at it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So
And we are.
Yep. So you'll get that. Well, Kathleen said you got it Wednesday. You'll get any comments that were added. They are due back, I think, January
8th.
8th.
Okay. So after the 8th, you'll get another set of comments. And then since that's after our January meeting, we will talk about it at our February meeting.
Good.
So the other thing we discovered in looking at the charter is the charter's not very specific about, it just says the operating cabinet has to review it every year. There's not a lot of clarity on how things get changed if we need to change them. So that's one of the things we should all probably look at in terms of governance. And because we do have a complicated structure being a city county board with a lot of community involvement. So those were the two things I needed to slip into the agenda.
Okay.
So the next thing that's actually on your agenda, so one of the tasks that is assigned to the commission is to appoint the representatives to the governing board for our database. So if we just had if our COC just had its own database, this board would be responsible for governing it. But because we're in a joint database with 9 other continuum of cares, this board will delegate representatives to that board on and so Tim the governing charter for the database gives each community 3 seats on the governing board. Tim had one of those seats, so we need to replace Tim. And we'd like to replace Tim with Sharika on the NCHMIS governing board. So we would need a motion from this group for that proposal to approve her joining that governing board on behalf of our COC.
So moved.
Thank you.
Was there a second?
I'll
Second.
second that.
Okay, all right, second. All right, any opposed? Thank you. Okay,
Did we actually ask Eureka before we did this, or is it just an assumption?
I think she might have been told.
Ah, voluntold. I love that policy. I come back in the
It
army.
comes as part of the job description. Welcome to the board, and there is no way off that board. Like once you're on it,
We're stuck.
the only way off is to retire or change jobs.
Good to know.
Yep.
Wow.
thank you, Sharika.
No problem.
So then the next item about the advocacy work around affordable housing, this is just a presentation that I have, and depending on discussion that you want to have after. So last month on our agenda, I talked a little bit about the COC had put together a working group to look at priorities around affordable housing. That we felt like as a COC, we should put our weight and energy behind in terms of advocating for, not just advocating sort of at the governmental policy level, but in terms of educating the community and having conversation and sort of leading conversation around needs in the community related to affordable housing. So the committee met. We met over a series of 5 meetings. The first meeting was really sort of a brainstorming session to look at what are all the issues around affordable housing that are important to the COC. And then the next several meetings, we work group members had done research on all those different areas, and we did presentations for each other. And then at the last meeting, we sort of evaluated each of the things we discussed over the 5 meetings and came up with this list of priorities. The priority is not in any order. It's actually in the order of presentations. So there's no ranking of this. But what we looked at in terms of prioritization, in terms of priorities, was expansion of permanent supportive housing capacity in our community, including more site-based permanent supportive housing. So actually, one of the things that's been happening over time is we've shifted resources towards rapid rehousing. We have shifted them away from permanent supportive housing vouchers, but we are still the primary mechanism for permanent supportive housing in our community are community-based vouchers, so people can go anywhere in the community. A number of communities, even in North Carolina, have more site-based permanent supportive housing, where it's easier to sort of coalesce key supportive services. So
Andrea,
yeah, go ahead.
it's just maybe me, but tell me more about what you mean when you say site-based.
Okay, so instead of having a voucher where the voucher holder, in this case, a chronically homeless person, could go to any apartment in the community, it would be a designated apartment community, like our ESR's 5th Street, where ESR owns the complex. They manage all of the residents in the complex, and ESR then provides the key supportive services that folks who are living there need.
Okay.
So it's in Charlotte, there's a place called Morehouse. There's another one that folks went to look at that just opened in Charlotte. The name escapes me. so Morehouse is an apartment building. The one they went to look at on Friday was a tiny house community. It was, I don't see the name of it.
And for those type of properties, is it all for permanent supportive housing, or is it just a portion of it?
So there's different models. So there's a program in Asheville that is run by a group called ABCCM that serves veterans, and they bought an old hotel. And so in that hotel, they have a range of housing options, including they have several rooms that are marked off for emergency shelter. They have a number of rooms that are grant per diem, which are a transitional housing program for vets. And then they also have a wing of the hotel that's all permanent supportive housing. So for vets who, just given their needs and the challenges that they're facing, really wanted to stay in a much more structured supportive program than going out on their own.
Okay.
So it could look, the permanent supportive housing could, if it's site-based, could look lots of different ways. The most recent site-based permanent supportive housing that we have come close to is our HEART project, where the HEART program rents the apartments. Robert lives at the complex where we have the HEART project. And so instead of owning the own property, the project is renting a block of apartments, and we have services on site for them. So
Okay, great. That's helpful.
Yep. So one of the things, a lot of folks who are chronically homeless do very well in vouchers that can be in any complex anywhere in the city that will accept the voucher. There are some folks who need much more intensive support and need folks around more often to make sure they stay on track. And that's what we're seeing in our homeless population. Is we've done an amazing job of housing a lot of chronically homeless people, but some of our hardest people to serve, who have the most significant, particularly mental health challenges and severe and persistent mental illness, need more intensive support than they're getting in a scattered site approach.
Right. Okay.
So the other things we're looking at is local and state investment in rental units that serve households below 50% of area median income. And there was some discussion about this at the operating cabinet on Tuesday, in terms of not the intent, but the language behind it. What we've seen locally is investment in affordable housing that is targeting people who are anywhere between 90 and 120% of area median income. So I'm trying to think. Those folks are probably making between $40,000 and $60,000 a year. The population that we're serving and are targeting in our programs are all below 50% of area median income. So area median income is, depending on your family size, but roughly 50,000. So 50% of that is 25,000. So that 50% of area median income are all our folks that are receiving only Social Security income. It would include often starting law enforcement, starting teachers, who are starting, a lot of support staff whose starting salaries are in the low to mid 20s, low 30s. And so really, we're not seeing a lot of investment, even for folks who are working, but whose salaries are below area median income, 50% of area median income. So there's lots of different strategies for investing in those rental units, but we really want to see an intentional strategy across the community, looking at how do we serve people with very low incomes.
Andrea, can I just mention that actually includes a lot of people that work at the hospital too.
Yeah.
There are a lot of people who are making $11 an hour.
Yep. So it's it's like our median income is we lined everybody up. It's the midpoint of income. So really, you know, half our population is below that midpoint. Then the other thing we're looking at is local incentives for maintenance or rehab of current units that are serving very low income households. So a lot of what we're seeing in apartment units that serve folks that we're housing is there's a lot of churn in ownership. Owners come in, they kind of buy the properties, they'll get as much rent out of the property as they can, and then they sell it. And they're not investing back in those properties. So we're losing those units pretty quickly. The other thing we found is that there's a lot of potential in properties where they may have boarded up units that the property owners are not investing in turning over. It is actually much cheaper to turn those units over than it would be to build new to serve this population. So the project that we were connected to at Northwood, those units, I think an average of about $5,000 to turn them over. They had been boarded up for years, most of them. So about an average of $5,000 in terms of cleanup, fixing up electric and plumbing, new appliances. And then there was some volunteer work that went into doing a lot of the cosmetic work. But we brought online 30 units. And the cash expense in all of that came from the property manager to turn those units. So we think there's a lot of potential if we can get a coordinated response to encouraging both maintenance and rehab of units that are currently online or that are part of complexes where they're being boarded up slowly. And then the last piece of the agenda that the committee is recommending is advocating for more targeted community-based mental health programs that support people in housing. So one of the challenges we see in our housing work is very specifically folks who have severe and persistent mental illness or even significant mental illness challenges are not receiving the mental health services that they need in order to be successfully housed in a community setting. So a lot of these folks that are people who 30, 40 years ago probably would have wound up in a state institution. But, you know, as the policy around the US has been moved away from institutionalizing people and putting them in community-based settings, this community has not developed the spread of services that will support people with significant mental health challenges in community-based housing. And so we really need to see a better development of those services to help folks who often don't need full-time support, but they might need a couple days check-in. They might need somebody who is helping them learn the skills and focus of how to manage the environment they're currently living in, helping them handle conflict resolution when they face challenges, helping make sure they're staying engaged in their medical care and receiving medication if they're on medications. The other place where we need targeted mental health services is in street outreach. So all of our street outreach teams, for the most part right now, are homeless service providers who have a range of skill sets. None of them are mental health service providers. And what they're running into on the streets are very serious mental illness challenges. And they're having a hard time engaging folks. They're having a hard time motivating folks to move because they don't have the resources or skill sets that a mental health professional would have. So we are looking at how can we infuse more mental health services and connect them to the work we're doing, trying to get people housed. And then at the Tuesday meeting of the operating cabinet, so those first 4 bullets is what came out of the work group. At the Tuesday discussion, other things that came up as important to flesh out as we flesh out this agenda more. One is support to reduce barriers to housing. So and you'll see on here, decreasing old landlord debt, access to things that make an apartment a home, like furniture, and then a landlord assurance fund or a risk mitigation fund for our clients who present significant challenges to the rental property, making sure that landlords can be made whole if there's damage or problems that they cause at the property. Also fleshing out what do we mean by affordable. So affordable can mean lots of different things. Typically the federal government has set a standard that affordable is 30% of your income is no more than 30% of your income is spent on housing. But just making sure that we are clear about what we mean when we say affordable. And then the other topic that was brought up was advocating for more tenant rights. So North Carolina is not the most tenant friendly of states. And what I shared with the operating cabinet is the work group. The work group did talk about all of these issues. We did not flesh out what is affordable, and I think that's something we'll want to do as a whole continuum across all of the groups that meet. We did talk about reducing barriers, and I think that is something that we should consider adding to the priority list. We did also talk about tenant rights pretty significantly, and one of the challenges we see is that in our voice as homeless advocates, we did not feel like our power would be the most effective around tenant rights. Although it's important to us, it's really important to us, it is not where we felt like, the work group felt like we would have the most bang for our buck in terms of leading the effort. Not that we wouldn't join or support other efforts that were doing that. The other piece of it is there's not a lot of other people across this, and this would be a state level issue. There's not a lot of stuff happening that we could identify at the state level around tenant rights that we would even join or support. So it's something that we think we should keep our eye on. We're happy to have more conversation and consider putting it on the agenda. But just concerned that in terms of prioritizing where we put energy and effort in leadership, that would not be the most effective use. So folks, the plan at this point is to have discussion here. This has not been presented to the full council yet, so we'll present it to them in January for comment and feedback. And then at the February meeting of this group, we'll present a fully fleshed out advocacy agenda for this group to adopt or not adopt as you choose.
Andrea, who's involved? I know I have wanted to plug into this and have not.
Yeah.
It's just partly me and timing, but who all is involved in this? I'm just curious.
In the work group?
In the affordable housing advocacy work group.
Shane participated in some of it. I'm trying to think who's here that participated in some of it. We had Richard Angino, who's an affordable housing developer. We had Mark Chiles, who works with some of our veteran programs. Phyllis D'Agostino, who works with families with newborns, many of whom many in her caseload are homeless families with newborns. Who else I'm trying to pull it off the top of my head.
I was just curious if you had any business, local business involvement.
We didn't have any local and business involvement. Mostly we were pulling from the COC membership. Okay. So we don't have a huge number of local business folks. Part of it, I think the agenda would be then to have conversations with local businesses about and we've always been engaged with them about how they're being impacted by homelessness, but really to help educate them about how these priorities for us would actually reduce homelessness and help take the pressure off local businesses around homeless issues.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts or questions? Okay. Hearing none, this is not your last chance to comment. If you have thoughts, please feel free to email me. I keep saying that in lots of different places. We're really trying to make sure people know we want feedback and comments. So feel free to email me if you have other thoughts or comments. We will present this to the full council at their January meeting, which is the second Tuesday in January. And then we'll flesh this out into a more full document and send it to you for consideration in February. So thank you. And I think the next agenda item is Laura, so I can turn this over to you, Laura. And Kathleen, if you want to give her power.
All right, Laura, you're the new presenter.
Okay, thank you. Give me 1 minute to. Okay, thank you for letting me present this. It's not going to be very much because it's really a conversation starter that I think Andrea will lead. I wanted to present this. This data was recently published by HUD. It's a simple presentation sort of point in time housing inventory chart and system performance data for the years from 2015 through 2019. And today we're just going to focus on one chart that has to do with data from the housing inventory chart. And just as a recap, the housing inventory chart is a chart that is submitted to HUD. It's a report that's submitted to HUD every year by all COCs in the country. And it lists all of the beds that are held by various agencies that specifically serve homeless people. So it provides the number of homeless specific beds throughout communities and the number of people that fill those beds on the night of the point in time count, which is generally the last Wednesday of January. So this report breaks the data down in 3 levels. It has nationwide data, then statewide data, and then data for our specific county. So I've just gathered the information all into one presentation for y'all. So we're going to focus on bed availability today. So nationwide, we've seen that throughout the last few years, since 2015, the number of shelter and transitional housing beds remains pretty stable. The number of permanent housing beds, which can include rapid rehousing beds and permanent supportive housing beds, have seen an increase, a slight and gradual increase since 2015. Based on the data in this report, we don't know the breakdown on these the permanent housing bars. We don't know how many of the beds are rapid versus PSH, permanent supportive housing, but we know that they are grouped in this chart. So when it says PH, permanent housing, it includes rapid rehousing and it includes PSH, like all together. So we can't tell if it was rapid rehousing or PSH that was that's attributing to this growth in PH beds, or if it was both. We just know that permanent housing beds have increased in the past 5 years. Next up is for North Carolina specifically. So it's the same data. The blue represents the shelter and transitional housing beds, and you'll see that after a dip in those beds in 2015 or after 2015, the numbers have stayed relatively stable. And then for the orange, which represents the permanent housing beds, there was a slight peak in 2017, but then there was a slight decrease after that. So again, we don't know the breakdown of the permanent housing beds represented in the orange. So we don't know if the decrease was attributed to a decrease in rapid, a decrease in permanent supportive housing, or both. So we can generally say that the decrease in the total number of rear-round beds was due to the change in permanent housing. And then we've got data specifically for the Winston-Salem, Forsyth County COC. So again, the shelter and transitional housing beds represented in blue stayed pretty stable throughout the years. But on the orange side, for permanent housing beds, there was a decrease, a gradual decrease throughout the years. And I think Andrea can probably comment on which program had the strongest decrease, permanent supportive or rapid. And I could probably prepare some more specific and detailed data for next time about that. But I just wanted to present this data for a conversation.
I don't know that I can provide much clarity in our own COC on what that breakdown looks like. I think I have lots of questions that I think as Laura begins to disaggregate that permanent housing data and we can look more specifically at it. Because the way rapid rehousing beds are calculated is they calculate that, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, they calculate them based on how many rapid rehousing clients are permanently housed and in rapid rehousing on the last Wednesday of January. Is that right?
Yes. On the HIC, the number of beds for rapid rehousing are counted based on how many of the hypothetical beds are actually full, right, that night. So if you have a rapid rehousing program that could fund around 60 beds, but only 30 of them are filled on the pit night, the 30 is what gets put on the HIC. But for permanent supportive housing, it's different. It's based on, and this is where I would like to have some more time to prepare. It would be based on what the grant can fund in a way. So that's where I would have to talk to the people who have the grant information so that I can make a chart that does disaggregate that.
Yeah, so with the permanent housing, it's either how many vouchers we can fund with the money, or like in the case of Fifth Street, how many apartment units they have. So Fifth Street's all 1-bedroom apartments. So I think Fifth Street has 18 apartments in it, if I'm correct. So that accounts for 18 permanent supportive housing beds. With the voucher programs, there may be a family that has a voucher, but each voucher counts as 1 bed, if that makes sense. So one of the things as we begin to disaggregate this, we can look at one of our strategies over the last 8-9 years has been to move money from permanent supportive housing into rapid rehousing. And one of the things that's been very clear in the rapid rehousing program is it is getting harder and harder for us to move folks into housing. And so people are in rapid rehousing for long periods of time. Much of that time, they are continuing to be homeless and not in permanent housing, so they won't show up as a permanent housing bed in here, even if they're in the rapid rehousing program. Does that make sense? Because this data is only counting people who are in rapid rehousing and in their own apartment.
So let me ask a clarifying question on this then, to Laura and Andrea. So when your chart says, permanent housing, rapid rehousing, and OPH, beds, I guess that's kind of a misnomer then, wouldn't that be correct? Other than what you just explained, Andrea?
So when you see that orange bar, those are representing either inventory units that are actual real live apartments, or they are vouchers, or they are people in rapid rehousing who have a lease for a unit. So they are they're counting leasable inventory, as opposed to people who are in rapid rehousing but don't have a lease. Does that make sense? Sort of, as much as this can make sense.
Well, clear as mud.
Yeah.
HUD makes it extremely easy to understand.
So the other way to think about it, if I'm a rapid rehousing case manager on the last Wednesday of January, and I have 30 people that I'm serving, 15 of them are people who have found an apartment, they have leased the apartment, and they are living in that apartment. Those 15 people show up in that orange bar. If I have somebody who has identified an apartment and the apartment has passed inspection, but we have not signed the lease and paid the deposit for them to move into that unit, that person is not in the orange bar. And if I'm still looking for an apartment, I'm not in that orange bar. So of my 30 people on my rapid rehousing caseload, I'm serving 30 households, only 15 of them count as permanent housing. So one of the things we'll have to disaggregate to look at what's happening in our COC is how much capacity have we moved from permanent supportive housing, where we have inventory units that we're counting, and what's happening in the rapid rehousing program in terms of a lot of different things. One is patterns of housing. So early in the rapid rehousing program, so before 2015, one of the things I noticed, partially having to do with grant years, is the grant year starts in December. So in that first year of the big rapid rehousing grant, a lot of people came in December and January to the program. And we've been sort of cycling that tends to be, certainly those first few years, a lot of turnover of new people towards the end of the calendar year, meaning they may not be housed in January. So one of the things I'd like to look at is the cycle of when we have new people coming in, when we have people exiting the program. Hopefully that's evened out over time, so it's not all in big clumps. Because we used to have a big push in January. It's like, get your leases signed. And we haven't done that, at least since 2015. But the other thing that we are seeing is in the rapid rehousing program, one of the things that has happened is, as a continuum of care, we prioritized all of our permanent housing. So everything that counts in that orange bar is prioritized to chronically homeless people. So even in our rapid rehousing program, all of the people that program is serving right now are either chronically homeless or very long-term homeless stayers, and they are very hard to house. They have been very hard to house for the last few years, but certainly in the middle of this pandemic, they are even harder to house because they have so many housing barriers. And there's just not a lot of movement in the rental market right now. So the other thing, just so you understand, and everybody who's listening in TV 13, our meetings are now public, in that we are on TV right now. And so we're trying to make sure that the data we present is is gone through all of the processes to be public data. So this data came from HUD. The Winston-Salem is our data that we gave to HUD, so it's public data. And so we're looking at making sure that data we bring to you has gone through all of the right processes to be public data. So when it winds up on TV 13.
Well, thanks for the rabbit trail there, Andrea. So let me ask this. So as I'm looking at the data from Winston-Salem, I'm thinking, gosh, this kind of looks bad. We're losing beds. Could it be that we are a victim of our own success? That we have capacity because we don't need as much capacity because we've addressed and answered the issue of chronic homelessness in Winston-Salem. So we are a successful COC. Is that a possibility by looking at this downward trend, Winston-Salem versus North Carolina and nationwide?
Laura or Sharika, I don't know if you have thoughts of that.
I would say no, because we have increased the number of people that are being served every year, right? So when we look at our AHAR or LSA data, where it's a cumulative number of people,
I thought we were decreasing that.
Well, I don't have the data prepared for today, but I would hesitate to make that conclusion.
Okay, I mean, I ask it because ultimately well, at least when we were in the 10-year plan, that was the goal, to have less and less chronic homelessness.
Right.
And towards the end of the 10-year plan, or at the conclusion of the 10-year plan, we had kind of bottomed out and we said, look, here is what we have as our chronic homelessness. And we've been so successful at addressing acute homelessness. That's been a very good process. And of course, that's our vision for the next 10 years or whatever, when we develop that new plan for the commission, so that we're going to make sure that when people come in and we can get them out pretty quickly and have a system set up for that. But anyway, I'm somewhat, you can look at a chart, we're trending downward, but this is, as I understand it, Laura, this is available housing kind of a way, not available housing, but people that are taking advantage, or we're using, or we have in the system where we're serving in permanent housing kind of circumstances. So that's like, as our numbers go down, it must mean that and the number of people we're serving are staying flat or going up. It would seem to me, either we don't have units available, which I don't think is the case. It's the other way around, that we're getting people into true permanent housing that's out of our purview, and we're no longer serving them because they're not considered homeless anymore. I don't know, that's just.
We can definitely look at our data and see what our data is saying, but I do like to emphasize that our data does not represent the demand in the community. Our data represents the number of people that our system is able to serve. So if we do see a decrease in the number of people that are served by our community agencies, it cannot, I don't think that it can or should be interpreted as there's less people in need. I think that if we did see a downturn, we would have to investigate the health of our system to see if there is a reason for that decrease in the number of people served. Because just knowing the data, knowing the state of our community outside of homelessness data, and when you take into account wages are stagnant or decreasing and the cost of living is increasing and everything, I would hesitate strongly to assume that there are less people in need.
Yeah, maybe one way to look at this to get to the points that you're all making is, if you could think about this as your supply, right? So if you could compare your supply to your demand, then you'd get a sense of how is it changing over time, as you're successful or not. So if you could just graph the two close, on the same graph to compare, that would be helpful.
So I think you mentioned that you don't have the demand data. Does someone have that data?
Our system, our database is for the collection of data of the people served by our programs.
So what we don't, so
organization has that data?
no, what we, so just to back up, I did pull up the LSA data through 2019. So in 2015, the total number of homeless people from the PIT count was 571. In 16 it went down to 544. In 17 it went down from there to 453. In 18 it went down to 440, and in 19 it went up to 454, which was essentially the same as it was 2 years before that. So it went significantly down from 2015, and then 2017, 18, 19 has been within 10 points of each other.
The point in time count is, as a reminder, a one night count.
Right.
So it's a fraction of the number of people who are homeless in a year, and that's the context for that data.
Yeah, I don't
This
have
is
the
point in
total.
time as well, right? So you're,
This is HIP.
These are
This is the
these are-
housing inventory chart.
bed counts, so not
but it's,
people.
but they're also point in time. Bed counts point in time.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think I forgot what I was going to say. Sorry.
Well, my concern, sometimes I think,
Yeah.
well, downward trends can be a good thing, and downward trends can be
Right.
a bad thing. So to me, I'm looking at it saying our housing at a point in time over the years, housing inventory. So this would mean what we have available is going down, whereas nationally it appears that it's going up slightly. North Carolina, a little trendward down, and so the trendward down, the way Jim put it, because our demand is overcoming our supply, or we're losing units, or shelters were closing, or that's just, of course, that's what Laura said. We need to dig into the data a little bit more to see why it's the way it is. But these are all great questions that we need to answer as a COC to make sure we're serving the needs of our community. That's all. Thanks.
Yep. And Susan, to answer your question, as Laura said, the data that we have is the data of people who come and ask for homeless services at the shelters, in our housing programs. What we don't have is people who don't come and ask for services from the shelter system, or our data on folks who are 100% street homeless is not as strong as it hopefully will be in the future. So this year is the first year that we have a COC funded street outreach program that will be entering data into HMIS on people who are just street homeless.
Yeah, thank you. That helps.
Yeah.
Are you able to depict the ratio between the folks who are asking for housing and those that are getting housing? Since you do have that data?
We have data of people, when I say people who are served, I mean people who are enrolled in these programs. Not everybody who is enrolled gets housed. We do have data on everybody who gets enrolled. That's what I mean by served, right? But we don't have data on, for example, everybody that calls an agency looking for some assistance, and then maybe they're told to come in for an appointment, but they don't come. Or maybe they are told about maybe some eligibility criteria and they opt out themselves, right? Agencies aren't keeping track of every call they get, for example. That's the sort of data that I would think would give us a better idea of demand. But it would be very difficult for that to be done.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah, that's almost like survey data.
Yeah, I think, Susan, what we can look at and look at through other reports is we can see how many people are coming into the system, which is roughly 1,700 people a year. And of those people, how many of them, because you have to come into the homeless system to get into any of our housing programs, how many of them go into a housing program? And so we can do that ratio. You know, what has been pretty consistent is of the people who come into the system, about half of them leave fairly quickly and don't ever get into a housing program. Like, I know that data. What we can run is sort of more specifically of those people who stay in the system, how many of them get into a housing program, and it's a much smaller ratio of folks, just because we have a significant number of emergency shelter beds that turn over, and then we have the supportive housing beds, both rapid and permanent housing beds, that don't turn over nearly at the rate that the emergency shelter beds do.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah, I think anything you can do to kind of add qualitative information to this particular because there's a danger in interpreting it the wrong way, obviously.
Right. And so one of the things, Robert, the reason I asked you if the caucus was meeting at the beginning of the meeting, one of the things I'd like to do is bring some more qualitative data. We always look at the quantitative data, and sort of have for you some sort of presentations on the experience of people going through the system and what that has been like for them.
Yeah, part of that is the whole thing of if somebody's going through the system, if they make noise, they may endanger their housing because they'll get thrown out of the shelters.
Yeah.
And the ones that are housed don't want to rock the boat because they don't want to endanger their housing.
So, question, Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
Do we capture basically those that come through the diversion part? So basically they come in for assistance and we temporarily divert them and then maybe they self-resolve. Do we capture that or?
We haven't in the past, but once the diversion program launches, we will. And I'm very excited about the diversion and prevention program because I think that will get us closer to having a picture of demand in a way that we haven't in the past.
Okay.
Yeah. So we don't have a lot of data on people who come in for short shelter stays right now.
Okay.
If that answers your question more specifically, we don't. Salvation Army did for a period of time run a diversion program, and we were able to get some good data from them, but that very specifically a very targeted diversion program at the family shelter, and people had to sort of be enrolled into that.
Okay, just for clarification, what do you guys consider a short shelter stay?
I mean, I would be interested in what's happening in anything under 30 days.
Okay.
I mean, for diversion's sake, that wouldn't be the definition I would use, but
okay.
I'm curious what's happening for those folks who are staying less than 30 days, what's working for them that gets them out. So the goal in our strategic plan is to have a system-wide average length of stay of 30 days or less. So I'm curious, like I'd be curious to see, but the problem with those folks who are in the shelters for 30 days or less is they don't tend to have the relationship with staff where we're collecting a lot of data to be able to analyze what worked well, like what did you need that you got from the shelter system that allowed you to stay under what our goal is and get out. So. Are there other, so we've talked about some data that we'd like to see, including fleshing out breakdown in that permanent housing between rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing, and maybe looking at sort of more trends of the utilization of rapid rehousing. Is there other data that you all would like to see that would be helpful for you?
I mean, nothing's coming to top of mind here, Andrea, but the more we can compare, the way I was thinking about it, just the way I'm used to thinking about it, right? Supply and demand kind of looks at things. So the more we can compare those types of things, the better. Give us a sense of, are we improving, and where do we need to improve?
Right. So, you know, the other challenge we have in understanding the demand side of homelessness, so we didn't, it was an oversight, we didn't add anything on the agenda this year as this month to update on the overflow. But in prior years, we would open winter overflow in December, and we would not see a lot of demand for overflow beds in the first few weeks, but it would start to ramp up. And by the beginning of January, we'd be running an overflow of about 100 beds. What we have seen this season where we are not running an overflow is most of our shelters still have open beds. So I didn't write the numbers down yesterday. Bethesda, I know, had, I think, like 8 beds for men, close to 20 beds for women. I think Samaritan was full, but they just have gotten full.
I think they have 2.
They have 2? Okay.
Salvation Army has 19, I believe.
Yeah. 19 open beds. So there's open capacity in the system right now that people aren't asking to come in. And even Cities with Dwellings has been having staff at their center to see if people show up asking for just to come into an overflow. And they haven't had anybody yet, even through the ice storm this week. Nobody's come asking for it. So one of the questions that we've started asking, and particularly Cities with Dwellings, who's been running this 100-bed overflow, is when we build something, what are we creating a demand for? When we don't have it, like we had 100 beds last winter and we had demand for them. We don't have 100 beds and nobody's saying where are those beds to us, at least to the homeless service providers. We're paying attention very closely every night what's happening with that demand, because we don't have a response if we fill all our beds right now. So, I mean, I think demand's sort of an interesting question in terms of, if we do have beds, people aren't using them, but we also have folks that are out on the street. We do have street outreach folks interviewing folks all the time who are out on the street about why they're out on the street. Some of them are just ineligible to come into shelters because of their criminal backgrounds. Some of them have mental health disorders that make being in a mass shelter setting very, very challenging for them. Some of them just would rather be in a tent than in a mass shelter. And so, how does that factor into demand, and what is it that we build as a system?
Right.
So.
Yeah, I realize it's a complicated question, right? So it makes analysis difficult. Just whatever you can do, right?
Right.
And even qualifying it the way you are.
And I think the other piece of demand is we cannot use the demand for homeless services as a marker for the demand for housing, because most people who don't have their own permanent housing don't actually come to homeless services. They double up, they move around. One of the things we saw early in March at the beginning of the pandemic was we got like a opening into how many people are staying in long-term stayers and hotels. So they're not, those folks all have a demand for housing, but they're not demanding homeless services. And so we have no measure of that, of what the housing demand would be. We just can measure, are people using the services we're currently offering?
And you said the criminal background check was for permanent housing?
No, we have, on the street, we have, there's a handful of folks who cannot come into shelter because of their criminal backgrounds. Mostly those are
housing first.
Not when they're sex offenders. They can't. The sex offenders can't come into the shelter because the shelter's too close to daycares and churches.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's the inherent. We have one shelter in the community that is currently located such that somebody who is on the sex offender registry wouldn't be in violation of their registry status. At last count, there were 5 known sex offenders that were needing shelter and not able to get it. We are looking at how we can serve those folks and get them off the streets since because they want to come off the street. The challenge has just been, it's very difficult.
Right.
Not just because of the inventory we have, but because the restrictions they have on where they can be. And if I'm not sure, and Dan, this might be something you can look into, the new location that the school system is looking at for Brunson Elementary, if they build where I think they are building, none of our shelters will be able to take sex offenders, I believe.
So do you think the county's going to not build there because of the 5 people, or I don't know how many people are housed there that are sex offenders, but let's say we got a half dozen. I don't think the county likely is going to change its plans.
No, they've had such a hard time finding a site for the new Brunson to begin with. I mean, I think it's something that probably behooves us to at least inform the county when you do this. This is one of your unintended consequences. I don't know that it would change their plan, but they should at least be informed.
Well, it might be good to have something that comes from the commission regarding that. Jen, you may want to compose a letter that just informs it to that effect.
So, Andrea, I know this was the last topic, and I'm not sure if there's more you wanted to cover this morning.
No, not unless folks have questions. I can give a quick overview of what's happening. Last month, we talked about the overflow plans for winter. We have expanded shelter bed capacity in that cities with dwellings, instead of running their traditional 100-bed overflow as a mass shelter setting, has a 40-bed, is that right, Laura or Sharika? I think it's a 40-bed hotel-based winter shelter.
They did 40 rooms, but some of them are double occupancy. So they have 44 folks right now.
Okay. So they have 44 hotel rooms they're using. Those are full. And then we are working with the city and some other members of this continuum of care to open a white flag program so that if the plan, as we talked about last month, is if it's 38 degrees with or below with precipitation, or ambient temperature of 32 or below, we would open a white flag shelter. Not 100% firm, but we're mostly firm that we will have a site for the program. The real challenge has been staffing, because all of our shelters, and particularly Bethesda and cities with dwellings that are the shelters that typically have staffed overflow over the years. They are running 2 additional shelters between them. They don't have the staff to help manage a winter overflow. They do have volunteers who are willing to help with the white flag, but we need somebody who has the skills and resources to understand how you manage a group of 60 to 100 people overnight in a white flag shelter. So we are reaching out to other organizations that may have folks with that capacity who may be able to help with the management piece of it. So,
Kendra, is it possible
yeah.
to train volunteers to have that experience, or you need someone who actually has qualifications?
We can train people for a lot of it, but it's we need somebody essentially who we can pay to be on staff who has enough experience running shelters that they can see the problems and solve them before they get out of control. And I don't think we could do that with a volunteer at that capacity right now. It's something over time, there would be volunteers that could rise to that. But just in terms of making sure that we have, just from a liability perspective, making sure that we have somebody who understands shelter logistics, because it's a whole different creature.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if anybody else who's been connected to White Flag or in any way has anything to add. It's just been the biggest challenge really has been, it's not the funding this year, it's people power.
Yeah, I've been working with the White Flag Shelter in Greensboro, and staffing has been one of their biggest points in meeting with me and stating that they did try the volunteer and regular staff mix in the beginning, and they urged us just to not do it because it was a very bad idea and a very great learning experience. So they just urged us not to do it. What they do is they use their regular staff, and they also have people who have either interned or has some type of current and past relationship with their organization, who's familiar with the homeless population and with different things such as mental health, substance abuse, and how to interact with the individuals that's experiencing homelessness. So that's one of the key things for them, having someone who's already had that relationship with your organization for a while. So that has been one of the biggest things, figuring out a way to staff and being able to serve everyone, because it is a low barrier shelter. So
if you happen to know anybody who's run a shelter in the past and be interested in some short-term work, we're looking for them.
And it's on call. It's not even
Right.
yes.
schedule.
That's the other challenge, is that it's an on-call because we're not going to do it every night.
Sounds like you're looking for a unicorn. It's kind of hard to find.
Yeah. So
That's a unicorn in a haystack.
Yes.
yeah,
So
that's our challenge.
yeah.
And the handful of people that those of us who are trying to organize this know in the community who have those skill sets are all people who've retired out of homelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, I'm too old to go into a room of people who may or may not have COVID.
Or they're still doing it but have too many other health issues
Right.
that could be a challenge. So
Yeah.
So, and the other thing we've also been, because we have been talking with the shelters about, is there a way we can sort of schedule your staff so that we would have folks like a week at a time who might have to come and help at overflow. The challenge with that is every time we start cross-pollinating people between shelters, if we have a staff exposure, we risk 2 shelters full of people. So, and we've come close a couple times. For whatever reason, logistically, I didn't think through we should have a staffing plan for what happens if we lose staff, like all the staff need to be isolated at one shelter. And knock on wood, we have not needed to have had that. We've come close a couple times because staff have particularly their nighttime monitors who work part-time at multiple shelters. If they become exposed, it impacts 2 shelters full of people. So,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, knock wood for sure.
Yep.
Okay, so anything else, Andrew, or anyone else? Appreciate all the information. Let me just say too, Andrea, I know you guys have worked like a lot of hours this year. I think you've done some really good work, not just this year, but in years past. But really this year, I know it's been especially challenging. So let me say thank you to you guys for all the work that you've done, and to the group for your continued efforts here. But especially to you guys, Kathleen, Andrea,
Thank you.
others on your staff here. So
Yeah, thank you.
It has.
and I hope you have a great some great holidays, and maybe you can take some time to rest. Knowing you won't, but hopefully you can.
I was going to, but the city put out this RFP I have to respond.
Darn city.
And they're not releasing it till Monday. It's not like I've been like, well, let me get it done this weekend.
I just want to second that. Thank you for everything you guys do.
You're welcome. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And your support and guidance has been invaluable this year. So thank you. Appreciate it. Have a happy
holidays.
Happy holidays. Happy New Year. And we'll see you very shortly after the new year.
All right, everybody.
Good day.
Talk soon. Thank you.
Bye.
Yeah.